Picture George Washington, the father of our country, the man on the $1 bill, first president, general, statesman, the embodiment of American dignity and leadership. Now picture him running the largest whiskey distillery in America. Barrels everywhere, stills working around the clock, thousands of gallons of liquor flowing out of Mount Vernon, Washington himself checking production numbers, taste testing batches, maximizing profits. Because that's what happened. After 8 years as president, after leading the nation through its founding, after establishing the office and setting every precedent, George Washington became a whiskey baron. By 1799, his distillery was producing 11,000 gallons of whiskey per year, the largest operation in the country. Washington wasn't just dabbling, he was dominating the market. The father of our country was also the king of American whiskey. This is that story. The retirement plan. It's March 1797. George Washington has just left the presidency. He's exhausted. 2 terms, 8 years. He's 65 years old and ready to retire to Mount Vernon, his estate in Virginia. He wants peace, quiet, a chance to focus on his plantation, maybe make some money. The presidency hasn't been particularly lucrative, and Mount Vernon needs income. His farm manager, a Scottish immigrant named James Anderson, approaches him with an idea. Mount Vernon grows grain, lots of grain, corn, rye, wheat, more than they can sell fresh. But grain spoils. It's heavy to transport. The profit margins are thin. Anderson has a solution. Turn the grain into whiskey. Whiskey doesn't spoil. It's easier to transport. And most importantly, it's worth way more money. A bushel of grain sells for pennies. That same bushel distilled into whiskey sells for dollars. It's brilliant economics. And Washington, who's always been a sharp businessman, immediately sees the potential. So in 1797, they build a distillery. Not a small operation, a serious facility. 2 pot stills to start, then 3, then 5. They're not playing around. George Washington is going into the liquor business, building an empire. The distillery at Mount Vernon grows fast, really fast. Anderson knows what he's doing. He hires experienced distillers, many of them enslaved workers who know the craft. They work around the clock during distilling season. The operation is impressive. 5 copper pot stills, a boiling house, cooling areas, storage buildings for the finished product. It's an industrial operation on the grounds of Mount Vernon. And Washington is hands-on. He's not just a silent investor. He's checking the books, monitoring production, tasting the product, making decisions about grain sourcing and pricing strategies. This is important. Washington isn't treating this as a hobby. He's running a business, a serious profit-driven enterprise. The whiskey they produce is unaged, straight from the still, clear and strong. This is before bourbon, before the tradition of aging whiskey in charred barrels. This is raw, powerful, frontier liquor. They make several varieties. Rye whiskey is the main product. Rye grows well in Virginia and makes excellent whiskey. They also make some corn whiskey and fruit brandies. And it sells fast. They can barely keep up with demand. By 1799, just 2 years after starting, Washington's distillery is producing 11,000 gallons per year, the largest whiskey operation in America. The father of our country is now the country's biggest whiskey producer. Let that sink in. George Washington, whiskey mogul. The irony of it all. Here's where the story gets really interesting. Because George Washington, the whiskey producer, has a complicated history with alcohol. As president, Washington dealt with the Whiskey Rebellion. In 1794, farmers in western Pennsylvania violently protested a federal tax on whiskey. They refused to pay. They tarred and feathered tax collectors. They threatened secession. Washington responded decisively. He led 13,000 troops into Pennsylvania, put down the rebellion, established that federal law must be obeyed. It was the first major test of the new government's authority. Washington enforced a whiskey tax with military force. Then, 3 years later, he opens his own whiskey distillery. The irony is thick. The man who sent troops to enforce whiskey taxes becomes the nation's largest whiskey producer. The president who put down the Whiskey Rebellion becomes a whiskey baron. And here's the kicker. Washington pays the tax. Of course he does. He's George Washington. But he's also benefiting from the same industry he once marched an army to control. Did Washington see the irony? Probably. Did he care? Apparently not. Business is business. The economics of whiskey. Why was whiskey such a big deal? Why build a massive distillery instead of just selling grain? The economics are straightforward. In the 1790s, transporting grain from western farms to eastern markets is expensive and difficult. Roads are terrible. Grain is heavy and bulky. It spoils if you don't move it fast enough. But whiskey is different. It's concentrated value. You can take a wagon load of grain and turn it into a few barrels of whiskey. Easier to transport, won't spoil, worth more money, and people want it. Demand is high. Whiskey becomes a form of currency on the frontier. People trade in whiskey, pay debts with whiskey. It's liquid assets, literally. For plantation owners like Washington, distilling makes perfect sense. They're sitting on tons of grain. They have access to water, fuel, and labor. They have space for buildings. Why not capture the extra value? So that's what Washington does. He takes his grain, adds expertise and equipment, and multiplies its value several times over. It's smart business. Whiskey is one of early America's most profitable industries, and Washington is right at the top. The workers behind the whiskey. But here's what we need to talk about: the uncomfortable truth behind Washington's whiskey empire. The distillery was run largely by enslaved workers. 6 enslaved men did most of the distilling work. They had the expertise, the knowledge, the skill. They made the whiskey that made Washington wealthy. James Anderson managed operations, but the actual distilling, the craft and labor, was done by enslaved African Americans. They worked the stills, managed the fires, monitored the fermentation, handled the dangerous, exhausting work of production. Washington profited enormously from their labor. The 11,000 gallons produced in 1799 generated significant income. Income that went to Washington, not to the people actually making the whiskey. This is the contradiction at the heart of Washington's story. The man who led the revolution for liberty and independence built his whiskey empire on enslaved labor. It's a reminder that America's founding generation, even its greatest heroes, were deeply compromised by the institution of slavery, that the wealth and prosperity they built came at an enormous human cost. Washington's whiskey success isn't just a quirky historical fact. It's a story about who did the work and who reaped the rewards. The legacy. Washington died in December 1799, just as his distillery was hitting peak production. He never got to see just how successful the operation would become. After his death, The distillery continued for a few years, but without Washington's management and reputation, it declined. By 1814, it had closed completely. The buildings eventually burned down. For nearly 2 centuries, the distillery was forgotten, a footnote in Washington's biography. The plantation, the presidency, the military career, those were what mattered. But in 2007, archaeologists excavated the site. They found the foundations, the remains of the stills, evidence of the massive operation Washington had built. And in 2007, Mount Vernon opened a reconstructed distillery, built on the original foundation, using Washington's methods and recipes. They actually produce whiskey there now, small batches for visitors to buy. You can visit Mount Vernon today and taste whiskey made the way Washington made it. Unaged, strong, straight from the still. It's like drinking history. The father of our country, preserved in alcohol. What this tells us. Washington's distillery reveals something important about how we remember history. We create these perfect, marble versions of historical figures. Washington, the dignified president. Washington, the noble general. Washington, the father of our country. But the real Washington was complicated. He was a businessman, a pragmatist, someone who saw opportunity and seized it. He didn't just want to serve his country. He wanted to make money. There's nothing wrong with that. It makes him more human, more real, more interesting. The whiskey distillery shows us Washington as he actually was, ambitious, practical, entrepreneurial, someone who could lead a revolution and also run a liquor business, someone who could establish a nation's government and also maximize his grain profits. He contained multitudes, hero and businessman, revolutionary and plantation owner, founder of a nation and producer of whiskey. That's more interesting than the marble statue. That's the real George Washington. The American spirit. There's something very American about Washington's distillery, the entrepreneurial spirit, the agricultural ingenuity, the idea that you can be dignified and also run a whiskey operation. Early America was built by people who did multiple things: farmer soldiers, lawyer politicians, statesmen, businessmen. Washington embodied that perfectly. He led armies, founded governments, and ran businesses. He did what needed to be done. And when retirement came, what needed to be done was making whiskey. It's pragmatic, it's American, it's Washington, and it worked. For a brief period, the father of our country was also the whiskey king of America. The man on the dollar bill was also the man producing 11,000 gallons of liquor annually. That paradox, that beautiful, complicated contradiction, is what makes the story so compelling. The final pour. So the next time you see George Washington's face, on currency, in paintings, on monuments, remember the distillery. Remember that this dignified founding father spent his retirement running the largest whiskey operation in America. Remember that history is complicated, that heroes are human, that the man who established the presidency also established a thriving liquor business. George Washington, general, president, revolutionary, founder, and whiskey baron. He led the nation for 8 years. Then he made whiskey, both with the same dedication, the same attention to detail, the same drive for excellence. That's the American story. Dignity and entrepreneurship, leadership and profit, revolution and whiskey, all mixed together, distilled into something uniquely American. Just like Washington's whiskey,